All right, yeah. So it's really heartbreaking because in our culture right now, and even specifically in the Christian culture, it's become cool and trendy even to say that you're deconstructing your faith or moving away from your faith. And it's heartbreaking because there's so many people that you see that are in the Christian spotlight who are doing this. Like, I think about Josh Harris, who says that he's no longer a believer. I remember reading I Kissed Saying Goodbye when it came out, and then following this guy to become a faithful pastor to church. And now he's saying he's not a believer. He says, there's no way you'd even call me an evangelical. And then I think of one of the lead singers in the band Jars of Clay, from the 90s. They're out. Derek Webb, who is calling himself an ex-Christian. Even now, we talk about the band Hawk Nelson, the lead singer of that, saying he's moved past how he's left Christianity behind. And there's this idea that it's for some reason it's trendy. It's trendy to say, oh, I used to be a Christian, and now I've put that behind me. I've moved on, or I've moved past Christianity. And what's usually happening, and this is really interesting, we heard from Spencer this morning talking about these false teachers in Jude. And he brought up the fact that these people are being led. They're being led away by their sensuality. They're being led away because their selfishness is wanting the things of this world to think about. As we, at the end of Colossians, talking about Demas, Demas, he's in Colossians, he's actually faithful. He's a faithful minister, but it's in the end of 2 Timothy, it says he's left us because he's fallen in love with this world. And what's really interesting is that, a lot of times we'll spend time talking about apologetic issues when in reality, we're not being grounded in Scripture, which is what we talked about yesterday and what Rob is going to talk about later today as far as being grounded in theology. And that many times that this falling away is not done in an academic mindset. It's done from our sensuality. And then we try to use academics as a way of like copying out and saying, I'm drawn away because I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this. And we're like, oh yeah, when the Christianity doesn't have answers for these things. And so this is really difficult. And what's frustrating is that for me personally, and I talked about this in a set we did this past summer, that earlier this spring, we Rhett and Link. If you're familiar with Rhett and Link, they have a show on YouTube. These guys they've been doing this for 15, 20 years. And they had a start in Campus Crusade. They started working together, Campus Crusade, at NC State. And before that, they're lifelong friends. They've been friends since they were in elementary school. And they grew up in the church, even spent time in the mission field, were involved in Christian ministry. And then this year in the spring, they decided to let everybody know about their spiritual deconstruction. And for me, this threw me for a huge loop because these are guys who grew up in the exact same context that I did. And it looks as if Rhett is intentionally attacking Christianity on an academic level, and Link is intentionally attacking Christianity on an emotional level. And so we're seeing this attack against Christianity, and it's getting this idea of us deconstructing the faith. And what I want to do right now is, so this summer we can give you a link to it. We did a session for student pastors on preparing your students for difficult questions, and that was addressing these individual issues that came up, right? So we talked about genocide, slavery, oppression to women, and hell, which were real specific cultural issues that kids would have questions about. But what I want to do is I want to take it a step even further back. I don't want to, this morning, we're not going to deal with like individual questions and individual arguments against Christianity. We're going to deal with Christianity as a worldview. Now, why I think this is important is I do think answering those individual questions are important. We've done tons of breakout sessions on those. But what I want to do is I want to provide students with a good context for even asking these questions, and that we can have confidence in the Christian worldview, because I believe that the Christian worldview is the only worldview that adequately makes sense of the world that we live in and adequately gives us answers for the human existence living in this world, because we cannot get away from the fact that every one of us has been created in the image of God, and we are living in God's world. Every one of us are image bearers of God living in God's world. We can't get away from that. It's impossible. So even when we are hearing these non-Christians or these people who claim to be Christians, they're like, oh, here's this. And when we get to the individual arguments, they're usually really shallow. They're usually really silly. And you think, wait a second, time out. You're telling me because of this little tiny question, you're like, I can't find an answer to that. And since I can't find an answer to that, there is no God. Wait, what a huge jump. I mean, even when we look for me personally, when I was listening to Rhett and Link give their deconstruction of the faith, Rhett said that when he was a Christian, or when he claimed to be a Christian, that he was overwhelmed with the need to have certainty for everything. He said, I have got to have certainty. And now what's happened is I've jumped out of the ship of Christianity and not into another ship, but just into an ocean of uncertainty, which is crazy because that's not the way that an academic argument is won. He hasn't been, even in his self-testimony, he hasn't been won over by a better explanation. He hasn't been won over by a solid argument. He's just given up on Christianity. And he says, well, I've given up on certainty, which is silly, right? Because not to be too sarcastic, but to be just sarcastic enough, you can say, are you certain? Right? Are you certain that you don't want certainty? And that's where I think as believers, we need to understand, we're always going to have questions. At the end of the day, we're still going to be finite minds trying to understand an infinite God. All right. So are there going to be things that are going to be confusing or hard to understand? Sure. Absolutely. I mean, Deuteronomy 29:29 says that the hidden things belong to the Lord. And then you think about in Paul, when at the end of Romans 11, after talking about these huge issues of God's sovereignty and salvation and man's responsibility, he says, oh, the depths and the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out, right? There's going to be some things that because we're not God, we're not going to be able to understand. And that should be fine. But what I want to do is I want to introduce this idea of Christianity, but the belief in Christianity, and I'm going to use the term because of the impossibility of the contrary, right? The impossibility of the contrary, that Christianity is the only worldview that makes sense of the world in which we live in. In fact, it is because of the tenets of Christianity that we even have a context to have doubts and to ask for questions to be answered, because we are image bearers of God living in God's world. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at two different sets of three. So, when Spencer was talking this morning, talking about the way that Jude organizes things in groups of threes. If he can do that, then we can too. And so what I want to do is I want to look at two different triads. That's right, triads. We're going to look at reason, science, and language. And then we're going to look at truth, goodness, and beauty. There we go. Reason, science, language, truth, goodness, and beauty. And the reason why I think this is super helpful is that if we can step back because the people talk about how you get too focused in on something that you lose the forest for the trees, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing happening, is that people they're digging into one thing. They're like, oh, I can't believe in a God who does this, or I can't believe in God because of this. You're like, okay, time out. It really is like you are comparing two different leaves and showing the differences in two leaves, and then saying, so the forest doesn't exist. See how silly that is? You can't just say, okay, here are these little contradictions and in these individual questions, so there is no God. God didn't create the world. Okay, so let's look at the world in which we live in and the experience that we're having. Because I believe that Christianity, it can be reasoned that Christianity is the only worldview that is externally consistent, like that it makes sense of the world in which we live in, and is internally consistent, meaning that it's not contradictory. Now, for us, but a lot of times we talk about the internal consistency and be like, okay, well, this part of the Bible says this says this, or how do we have an answer for that? Or even like with the problem of evil, how do we answer this? Okay, I understand that, and there's a place for that, but what we're going to do is we're going to step back and talk about how it makes sense of the world in which we live in a way that no other worldview does. All right, so let's look at reason. All right. Every one of us, we assume the reasonableness of reason, right? We use words like rational. We say common sense. But where does this impulse come from? Why are we asking this? We ask the question why to a person or even to the universe. And the reason why we're asking why is because we're assuming that there is an intelligible answer for us. You see the issue? Like, why would we even assume that there's a reason for why? For Christians, we can do this because we believe, again, God's image bearers created in God's world. We ask the question why, and we expect an answer. And when someone is acting outside the bounds of rationality, we say there's something wrong with them. Isn't that crazy? Oh, that guy's acting unreasonable. That is irrational. And those are negative things because we're assuming this baseline of rationality. But why in the world are human beings rational? How do we have reason? How are we able to think? And we don't impose the same type of rationalistic behavior onto animals, right? I mean, that's what it's really important that we think that, right? Because when you see a bird flying into a window over and over and over, you're not thinking, man, someone needs to get that bird a good education. No, you're thinking that's an animal. If you saw a human being do that, you'd think something's wrong with that guy's head, right? Or you just think, what a great sense of humor, but we can talk about that. Maybe that goes into beauty. But anyway, so, see what I'm saying? Like, we assume that human beings are rational people. Why do we do that? We do that because we are human beings created in the image of God. And even this is what's crazy, is that for we as Christians, we have an answer for why people act rationally, and we have an answer for why they act irrationally. Because what we believe is that human beings have been created in the image of God, and that God created this good creation. We were part of that good creation, but it has been damaged by the fall. So theologians use the term the Noetic Effects of Sin because we believe that human beings, even our thinking, has been darkened, but it hasn't been darkened completely. It's not black, it's twisted, right? It's twisted because we believe that we still retain some semblance of the image of being an image bearer of God, even though it's been damaged in the fall. So we can understand why people act rationally and why some people act irrationally. That non-believers don't have an answer for that. In fact, it was Darwin, right? Okay. Charles Darwin, in a letter to a friend, was talking about a doubt that he always had. And his doubt was this. He says, "But then with me, the horrid doubt always arises, whether the convictions of a man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust the conviction of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" What? Okay, so he's got to the crux of the matter. Right? We believe that human beings' thoughts and words are intelligible, but why? Why? Where did that come from? You have to have an answer for that. You can't just say, oh, because it's reasonable. No, time out. Where does that reasonableness come from? And I'm saying it comes from the mind of God, who created us in his image. And that the naturalistic mindset has no way of accounting for that. You can't just say, oh, well, somehow through the process of evolution, we started to become more rational. No, that's crazy. And let's think about this. This is getting way too deep for the time that we have now. But we talk about rules and laws of logic. You can take classes on the collegiate level and taking logic classes, and there are laws. There are laws for logic. Now, if you're in a materialistic mindset, then you don't even have a category for non-materialistic realities, for non-materialistic absolutes. And the laws of reason, the laws of thought and logic, those are non-materialistic absolutes. We hold those to other people, or else they're being unreasonable. And for materialists, there is not even a category for that. We can't have that because it's non-material. You can't point to it. You can't put it under a microscope. All right. So I'll say this is a guy. I've been reading a book called Post-Christian by a guy named Gene Veith. It's really good. He says this: reason itself rests on assumptions that elude rational proof, but are taken on faith. I'll read that again. Reason itself rests on assumptions that elude rational proof, but are taken on faith. So for all these people that say, I am a rationalist, that reason is my guiding principle, they have to take that on faith, that their reason is trustworthy. And we know why, because they're image bearers of God, living in God's world. All right, so let's next move on to science. In science, same thing. Like, we have scientific laws. Again, this is crazy. Can you point to it? Can you put the law of gravity under a microscope? No, you cannot. There's not a category for that. And how is it that the world that we live in is actually submitting itself to these natural laws? That doesn't make sense. If everything is just randomness and chaos that came into existence out of nothing with no purpose, and then it just evolved into everything we have now, then why do we assume that we can even make sense of the world in which we live in? But that's what science does. You look at the scientific method. What we're doing is it's as if the world and the universe that we're living in is going to continue to operate on this rationalistic basis, that it has these rules and these laws, these eternal constants that are always going. And so we'll ask a question, and then we'll do an experiment, and we'll test to see if what we thought was going to happen is going to happen. And somehow it consistently happens all the time. Why? Well, because this is God's creation. This is the way he created it. Galileo said that mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe. Mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe. And now, through the period of the Enlightenment, we thought that we would be able to take all the mystery out of the world by studying creation. Before that, people talk about how, in the Middle Ages, the Christians thought that they studied science so they could understand God better, but we grew past that and we became rationalistic, and we're trying to take all the mystery out of it. But what's crazy is that, and this again, Gene Veith again, he says this, he's talking about how the deeper we get into the mathematics of the universe, the more ordered it appears. The mathematical order of the universe goes beyond this or that particular example of intelligent design. Mathematics shows that everything is designed. Even randomness can be accounted for mathematically. What? That's right. When we get to beyond the microscopic level, the smaller we get, the more we realize that this universe was written in the language of mathematics, which again is a non-material reality that we say is real, but it's non-material. Because we can hold to that. A materialist, understand this. The materialist has no answer for anything that you can't look at under a microscope, that you can't point to, that you can't touch. So any of these non-material realities, a materialist doesn't have an answer for, even if they are living their lives basing their whole science on these immaterial realities. He also said this. He says that mathematics works would suggest that there is a connection between mind and matter, or that there is a mind that has constituted the physical world, making it possible for lesser minds to comprehend. It's the same thing that there's a quote attributed to Einstein, says that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible, right? You see what I'm like? This is what we're getting at. We live in a world that makes sense. Why does this world make sense? Because it was ordered by a God who continues to sustain it. And people will say, well, what about miracles? Well, miracles make sense if you have a sustaining God, because God is actively involved sustaining this universe. If he wants to move something differently, he can do that. If he wants to make something heal quicker, if he wants something to be destroyed, if he wants something to come out of nothing, he can do that, because God is the one who has created this world and he's making it happen. And he's writing the rules so he can change them whenever he wants to. The next is language. Again, this goes along with rationality, but in reality, what we're understanding is that we can't even think apart from language. Think about that. When you're thinking, what are your thoughts? Your thoughts are, we think in language. But where did this come from? Right? How did this happen? How did this evolve randomly out of nothing? The evolutionists have no clue. They'll make stuff up about a noble savage that basically just got lucky and somehow developed this ability to communicate, and then we've refined that, and we've refined this communication up until now. But there's no basis for this. It's all just speculation, and it goes against the tenets of evolution. How is language helping you survive? Right? How does it happen incrementally based on survival? This doesn't make sense. All right. So the fact that we can think, the fact that we have language makes sense because we have a God who is the Word, who is the Logos, who is organizing everything about this world, including the way that we think. And our brains have been structured by a God who is language and who speaks in language to us and has hardwired us for this language. All right. So even for this is what's crazy. because for a non-Christian, they do not have an answer for why we have language and why we can communicate in language. But what they will do is when a non-Christian uses his language to say that there is no creator, it's ludicrous. It's like a child who crawls up onto his father's knees so he can slap him in the face. And this is what we need to understand, that for non-believers who are living in God's world, they're having to make their lives livable. They're having to borrow from Christianity. So they're even taking an attack against Christianity using the tools that they've inherited from Christianity. Because we live in a world that God created, and we are image bearers of God. So anytime we're using something, when we're using language to attack God, language is a tool that he gave us, that he hardwired us for. All right. So next, let's look at truth, goodness, and beauty. In reality, this is overwhelming. We're covering so much of the nature of reality, and we're trying to do it in 30 minutes. There are a bunch of books that have been written over this, but the main reason I want to talk through these things is so that we can help students have a context to be able to deal with all of these things that are attacking them. We need to be able to give a firm foundation so that we have, okay, I know that I'm a thinking individual. I'm rational. I'm living in this world that makes sense, and then have that as a context with which they answer all these other questions. So are some of them going to be difficult? Yes, absolutely. But we have the context. We can't get rid of this. So like even think about with Rhett, like he jumped out of the ship of Christianity and he says he's not in a ship. He's just in uncertainty. Well, that's useless, right? He hasn't been won over to believe anything. But what's crazy is that even the ability to doubt is only possible because of the context of the Christian worldview. All right, so let's look truth, goodness, and beauty real quick. Truth, this would be laughable if it wasn't so heartbreaking, because our culture is reaping the consequences of the postmodern movement that says that, there is no absolute truth, which is it's self-defeating. Just like we talked about yesterday with the idea of saying that everything is a reader response at the death of the author, you have to assume authorial intent to deny authorial intent. So you have to assume truth to deny truth. You can't say there is no absolute standard of truth and then expect that to be absolutely applied to everybody. So, what we've done in our culture is we've been like, well, if you can't impose your belief on someone else, see how oppressive that is? Well, but if it's true, then we all have to live underneath what's truth. And not only that, but there is truth that exists in the world. To say that there is no truth is to make up a truth trying to negate itself, which isn't possible. All right. Let's keep moving. Goodness, this is huge. Right? Because we all use morally loaded terms, right now, right? Good, bad, fair, just, evil. Okay, what about justice and equality? We are trying as hard as we can that our whole culture is bending towards justice and equality. Justice and equality. Well, where's the foundation for that? I can tell you, I know the foundation for that. The foundation for that is that we are all human beings created in the image of God. That every human being has eternal value and significance because they are image bearers of God, created for a relationship with the eternal God who created them. That's why we have this inside us, this desire. Man, we need to seek justice. We need to seek equality. But if you divorce that from the Christian worldview, then you have to determine on your own what justice and equality are. But not only do you get to determine what justice and equality is, everybody has that right to determine justice and equality. And then those words just become meaningless. All they become is statements of opinion. I don't like that. I don't prefer that. I'd rather that grown men don't rape and murder little children. That's my preference, but you can't impose that on somebody else. But everybody in the world imposes their standard of morality on someone else. In fact, what's super crazy is that the non-Christian world will impose this huge standard of evil onto God, so that Christians are constantly, well, how do you deal with the problem of evil? Great question. And that's going to take some time. We need to sit through and we need to think through that. But for the non-believer, they have an even more daunting argument against sin because they have the problem of good. How can you say that one thing is good and something is not? You're imposing your standard of morality on me by saying that Christianity, that God allows evil. Where do you get this idea of evil from? You can only get this idea from evil because there is a standard of good, that not just a standard of good, but that is a standard of good that applies to everybody. I mean, we see this happening all the time. You can't go 30 minutes without making some sort of moral judgment about somebody. And Christians know why that is, because we are image bearers of God, an all good, all powerful God who made us in his image. That is why we have the concept. And that is why non-believers have the concept, because they might be denying God, but hardwired into them is a standard of right and wrong, good and bad. See, so when we're moral creatures created in God's image, and it's crazy because there are non-Christian thinkers and philosophers. You can read them, and they will say, no, there is no standard of right and wrong. It doesn't matter. Whatever you want, it's whatever's good for you is good. These are all just opinions. But they wouldn't say that if you punched them in the stomach and took their wallet from them. They would be crying out for justice. Why? Because beyond all of the rhetoric that non-Christians want to throw out there, they still hold to an absolute standard of right and wrong, good and bad. And they will hold you to that, and they'll hold Christianity to that. But they are ignorant that they don't realize that professing to be wise, they've become fools. That is exactly what we see in Romans 1 when we reject the creator God of the universe, that it affects the way that we think, and not just the way we think, but the moral judgments that we're making. And the last thing is beauty. Truth, goodness, and beauty. These are kind of the triad that you have in ancient philosophy. And it's crazy because every day I get to experience this. I mean, Andrews, North Carolina is gorgeous. We live in a beautiful valley. Last night, 2 nights ago, we were driving outside at night with me and the kids. We had the top off of our Jeep, and we're just looking up at the stars. And Parker was just blown away. How amazing this is. I've never seen this many stars out. And it's crazy because when we see this, like this idea of beauty that exists in the world in which we live in, like it's so humbling. Right? And we all have that. No one goes out and looks at the sunset and is just like, man, look at all these chemicals that are reacting differently in the atmosphere. No, we're just like, man, that's gorgeous. I mean, how many times does that happen where you'll be inside and someone's like getting your attention? Hey, look out there. Look at it happens here at camp all the time. The sun will set just outside of the coop, and we'll go out there and you're just awestruck. C.S. Lewis talked about this as this numinous feeling that we're overwhelmed because there's something bigger than us. And yet that's the nature of beauty. And why is it that we're all like, yeah, everybody, why are we all stunned when we're seeing this sunset? Well, because there's something in us that acknowledges God's good creation that he made for us. Has it been damaged? Yes. But there's still the remnants of creation, and there's remnants of us as image bearers of God. All right, so there's way too much information for us to cover. And part of that is intentional. Part of that is that we need to realize, oh man, like the evidence for Christianity, it's like, it really is like, it's overwhelming. It should be overwhelming. And we should realize that we live in a world where we can trust reason, that the scientific discoveries should give glory to God, that there's truth, there's goodness, there's beauty, that we're speaking in language, and we take all of these things for granted. But for us to do this, we're having to borrow from the good things that God has given us. And so I want to challenge y'all, and you need to be challenging your students. Man, you have an objection to Christianity? Great. Don't throw it all out, right? Again, that illustration, you can't use the fact that 2 different leaves look different to say that there's no tree, right? We're living in God's world. We're image bearers of God, living in the good world that God has created, and we need to give him glory for that, and we need to trust. And a lot of what we're saying, I'll say this real quick and then we'll open up for questioning. A lot of what I'm talking about, it would apply to Islam and Judaism, because we're talking about an all good creator God. And that's where I think that's a great conversation. And that's where I would say that the internal consistency, I think that Islam is internally inconsistent, that Judaism is intentionally pointing towards a fulfillment and can no longer be practiced right now, and that it's always was pointing towards Jesus. But what we're doing is we're not seeing students that are like, man, I'm leaving the faith and I'm becoming Jewish. I'm leaving the faith. I'm becoming Muslim. What we're seeing is people saying Christianity doesn't have the answers. But what we need to understand is that Christianity provides the only context that those doubts and those questions can be formed, much less answered, and that Christianity will answer these questions. And that's where we do the hard work discipling students. You can look at the session from the summer on preparing students for difficult questions, but I want us to understand, I want us to be overwhelmed by the fact that the Christian worldview is the only worldview that adequately makes sense of the world in which we live in. All right. Do we have any questions?
We do.
Oh, great.
Caleb Bax.
Hey, Caleb.
Said, my students know I'm in college with Red Link and they're obsessed with them. Would it be wise to guide students away from watching them now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the reason why I think that is because, we don't ask that question a lot of times with openly secular entertainment, right? I don't know whatever show kids are watching, but for the most part, people aren't like, oh yeah, or like YouTube channels, right? We don't often intentionally discourage people like, oh, I know they're not a Christian. And we would even say that like, oh, this movie is it's not Christian, but it's fun to watch, right? But the thing about Rhett and Link is that I really do believe that Rhett and Link, it's possible they are just like these false teachers from the book of Jude, right? I mean, these are people, and because in giving their explanation, like the two podcasts that they did with where they were talking about the deconstruction of their faith, and they've done a lot more. I would say this, that it is for students who are more solid. You should. So Rhett and Link, they've got two different main avenues for entertainment. The one is the Good Mythical Morning, and for the most part, that's just silly, goofy stuff. But then they've got the Ear Biscuits podcast, where they're talking about more real life issues. And I think there's probably not much damage in the Good Mythical Morning, even though I think it's only about 47% funny. But the damage would be in what they're talking about with the Ear Biscuits, and that if students are listening to that, then it'd be great. It'd be a great opportunity to have conversations about it. Because I know even like they did an episode on, do they believe in hell? They talked about other questions that they're having, like mystical, supernatural stuff. And that's where I think the real damage can come into, is because if people are respect to this person and they're saying these things, then that's kind of drawing us away also. But again, it's a good opportunity to reiterate the fact that like you can't, saying I'm jumping out of Christianity into uncertainty, that's just ignorant and silly and not possible. You can't do that. You're embracing some type of certainty, whether you are acknowledging it or not. So all that to say, it's a discernment issue, but if your students are going to be like watching and listening to it, it'd be helpful to be having conversations with them about what the content is, and maybe listening or watching as well, so that you can have those conversations.
Got a good bit of questions coming in.
Great.
So Zordy's asking, he said in Link's story, he says his deconstruction started not with an intellectual issue, but he realized that he no longer had desire for Christ, but was still a professing believer. If you could have sat down with him when he was initially beginning that struggle, how would you counsel him?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay. Yes, and that's where I do think that for Link, he was openly saying that for him it was more of an emotional issue, and that's where I think sadly we have a lot of, and that's I'll go back to what we talked about yesterday in the breakout session with showing your work and teaching to fish, because it seems like that for so many people they lose a zeal for God and for His Word because they've been so dependent on someone else being able to. They've been dependent on someone else's relationship with the Lord. I think for me, I spent a semester in New Zealand with a missionary, and he loved cricket and rugby. And of course, as a good American, I didn't know what either one of those things were. But watching him get excited about cricket and explaining strategy, it was exhilarating. I started to really enjoy it because he was saying, oh, he's going to try to do this, and oh, and this guy does this. And it's just like, oh man, this is awesome. Well, for him because it was a part of him. Like, he is a student of the game. He loves it. He's emotionally invested. So when he's watching this, he's seeing more and more, and it's exciting. It keeps him attentive. And then when he was sharing that with me, man, I got excited because of his zeal. Well, a lot of times that's what we're doing in student ministry, is that we're excited about it. And so they're excited about it. But if we're not teaching them that they can do this on their own, that they can drink deeply from communion with God through his word on their own, then they're going to get to a point where you're not there, and they don't know whatever drew them to this and drew them to God in the first place. There's a lot of words there, but I think that's what I would have wanted to talk to Link about, and to show him the beauty of God's word, to show him the beauty of the gospel, to help him to taste and see that the Lord is good. And I think if we can, again, going back to what we said yesterday, if we're and I think also that just gives us a better understanding, a better context to deal with all these difficult issues anyway. I mean, if you're in love with your wife, and every day you're spending time with her, and someone questions her commitment to you or your commitment to her, it's going to have a proper context of, no, we love each other. We are in constant fellowship with each other. She said that to that person over there. Well, I've got a better context for that because I know that she loves me. And if we are constantly growing in our relationship with the Lord, and we're drinking deeply of God's word, then it gives a proper context for these other objections as well.
So I'm going to combine to Kelly Hitchcock and Will Morris with had similar questions of like Kelly was saying at least 75% of the students he's had through the years don't have interest in this. And then him and Will are both saying, how do we get students interested in this type of thinking? And then Will's question is more, how do we get them to come to us with these questions rather than listening to YouTube or celebrities or social media?
Yeah, great question. So if you didn't hear what Harry said, like, a lot of students aren't interested in these types of things, and how do we get them to come to us with these types of questions? Those are both really good. I think for as far as personal interest, it's the same cricket analogy. Like, if we can, even if the time that we have these students in our ministry, we need to be dropping these breadcrumbs, like even just saying over and over, like whenever we're preaching through a different passage of scripture, we can point to these eternal realities, and we can say, and you guys remember, like, and talk about how we live in a world created by God. We're image bearers of God, and the implications that has. I mean, I heard for years, right? Oh, you're creating God's image. And I just thought that means human. And never did I even think about trying to unlock all of the different ways that we've been created in God's image, and the goodness of the world that the goodness of the world that God's created. And so I think constant reference to these, so that we can have zeal for these things. And we need to be talking about these popular issues. Like, you need to, the guy from Hawk Nelson or Derek Webb, which would be, if you were doing student ministry in the 90s, and or even like we have Josh Harris, like these guys who are coming out, and Rhett and Link, they're deconstructing the faith. Bring attention to this and say, okay, this is happening. Have those conversations. Why are these happening? And then if you're able to foster that type of community where students are, and you guys realize this, that you're making disciples. And more often than not, if you're genuinely making disciples, they are going to take on certain characteristics of you. And so make sure that we are constantly teaching, showing not just, even like we talked about yesterday, not just good Bible stories, not just good moral application, that we are showing the superiority of the Christian worldview, that we are showing that God is the eternal, powerful creator of the universe, and nothing makes sense without him. That help?
I think so.
Okay. You're welcome, Harry.
Luke from Crabapple First Baptist said great stuff.
Thank you, Luke.
But he said, how do we train parents to be prepared and proactive in having these discussions with their kids?
That's awesome. And what an awesome question to ask. And what I would do is, if possible, to be able to do a once a month parents' night where you can talk about current cultural issues and the implications that they have, what's really being said, however you can do that. If it's however that's possible. I think once a month is a great timing to say, all right, parents, this is what's happening with your students. This is what the stuff that your students have been dealing with. This stuff that's happening in the popular culture right now. How do we answer that as Christians? Because you'll realize that most parents love their children. They want what's best for them. They're providing for them. They're giving them all the best opportunities, but they don't know how to adequately prepare their students for the attacks that are going to come against them when they go to a university. And they don't know what's being undermined right now in the popular culture. So as simple as that, if you could do a once a month parents night where you can talk through, bring out these issues, have an email set up where you're going to email all of them. This is what we're going to be talking about, and talking about it on those Mondays. Mondays? Why did I say Monday? Maybe Monday nights is a good time for that? I got distracted. On those nights, once a month. There we go.
Somehow that.
Morgan, it's you again.
That's all the questions. Unless the live studio audience has any questions.
Any questions from the lives? There are thousands, tens of thousands of, yeah. Yes. Okay. For students as a resource, I think that that's a little off. It's not necessarily talking about, everybody should read The God Who Is There by Francis Schaeffer. But I think the best introduction to any type of apologetic issues, they're not so much dealing with the topics we talked about today, although they're dealing with other corollary talks. As the Case for Christ by Lee Strobel is the best introduction to any type of apologetics. It's just the best, small, easy to read chapters, and then from those chapters, the bibliography is what's amazing. And I think another really great book right now that students, the high school students, on a high school students level, is A Shot of Faith to the Head by Mitch Stokes. A Shot of Faith to the Head by Mitch Stokes is just awesome. It's wonderful. I think those are the three best introductory books to apologetics.